Listening to the BBC World Service.
Our Latin America online editor is Vanessa Bushluter, and she is
Let's speak now to our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg. And Steve,
our correspondent Bethany Bell has been following the UN talks.
Our South America correspondent Katie Watson spoke to us from Sao Paulo.
At bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Phoebe Keane, and this is The Thought Show. Coming up today...
Now all we need is an economist who could tell us more about him.
Charlotte, I'm an economist.
Who are they talking about? And do you recognise the mystery economist?
Also, how trackable are your selfies?
Even if there are no geotags, we can do the geolocation with other means, which is we just single out specific unique objects in their photographs.
And finally, what is this? Tune in to The Thought Show to find out after the news.
Hello, I'm Jerry Smith with the BBC News. A second and final deadline has just expired for the head of the regional government of Catalonia to rescind the declaration of independence he made and then suspended last week. Spain's central government has pressed Carles Puigdemont to drop the claim he says the Catalan people earned when they voted in an unconstitutional referendum earlier this month. If he persists, Madrid has threatened to begin removing the Catalan government's autonomous powers. The Catalan MEP, Ernest Urtasun, is hoping neither action is taken.
Both decisions lead us nowhere. A unilateral declaration of independence leads to a political conflict but has no clear political exit. On the other hand, the suspension of the Catalan autonomy would provoke a major rejection on the side of the Catalan society, and it leads us to more political instability. So what we are saying, and I think this is a growing feeling of many people in Catalonia, is that we need to get to a scenario of de-escalation. We want talks to resume immediately. I think this is clearly what the majority of Catalans want today.
The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been given his own political theory, entrenching his position at the top of China's ruling Communist Party. An announcement at the party congress in Beijing said the president's ideas would be known as Xi Jinping thought. Here's Michael Bristow.
So far, we only have a vague sense of what Xi Jinping thought stands for. The party says it's socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That's a difficult phrase to understand, but to a large extent the fundamentals of this new theory are unimportant. This announcement is notable mainly because of its symbolism. Xi Jinping has become the first Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping to lend his name to a political theory, suggesting his authority extends further than China's previous two presidents. And before, the only Chinese leader to have his own thought was Mao Zedong.
Figures just out show that China's economy grew 6.8% in the third quarter. The growth was slightly lower than the previous quarter, but still ahead of the government's full-year target of 6.5%. Observers say the figures were in line with expectations. New Zealand's Labour Party, led by Jacinda Ardern, will form the country's new government, in coalition with a small nationalist party, New Zealand First, and the Greens. Hal Griffith reports from Sydney.
Jacinda Ardern only took the reins as Labour leader in August, revitalising its fortunes in a wave of so-called Jacinda mania. Although the party finished behind the ruling National Party in September's vote, it won the battle to negotiate a deal with the minority parties. The agreement, finally announced today, is likely to mean a significant cut to immigration quotas and new controls on foreign ownership of property.
Hal Griffith. World news from the BBC. The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have been used to launder hundreds of millions of dollars stolen from the South African state. The British Treasury has referred allegations raised by the former Cabinet Minister and anti-apartheid activist Peter Hain to the Serious Fraud Office. Defence officials in Afghanistan say at least 43 soldiers have been killed in a Taliban attack on a military base in Kandahar province. 9 soldiers were wounded and 6 unaccounted for in the assault in the district of Maiwand. Reports said several gunmen stormed the military facility after explosive-filled vehicles rammed the entrance. Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total insect biomass. Insects play a vital role in pollination and as a food source for birds. The study said the use of pesticides could be to blame. One of the researchers, Caspar Haumann, said it confirmed what's known as the windscreen phenomenon.
We've been alarmed by many people claiming to have less insects being squashed on the windscreens in recent years. But then we never had the scientific data at hand to be able to say this is really the case. And this is the first time that we can actually confirm that, well, what you see on your windscreen is actually taking place, and here's the figure of 75% at least.
An appeal court in Tunis has upheld the public indecency conviction of a couple arrested in September for kissing in a car. Nessim Wadi, who is French, was also accused of refusing to obey police after they apprehended him and his Tunisian girlfriend. The couple were given lighter sentences than the original terms handed out at their October trial. BBC News.
Hello, this is The Thought Show on the BBC World Service with me, Jordan Dunbar.
And with me, Phoebe Keane.
Coming up later on the programme, why do people hold their breath? We join Lucy Ash as she tries to find her inner dolphin.
But first, the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics was awarded to Richard Thaler. But who is he? And what is a behavioural economist? Here's Charlotte MacDonald with a mystery guest.
Hello and welcome to More or Less on the BBC World Service. I'm Charlotte MacDonald, and this week we're talking about the latest recipient of this year's Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics, Richard Thaler. He's Professor of Behavioural Science and Economics at the Chicago Booth School of Business in the US. Now all we need is an economist who could tell us more about him.
Charlotte, I'm an economist.
Aha, Tim Harford. Really, you kept that undercover. Do you know about Thaler?
I do know about Thaler. I've interviewed him, I've met him, I've read his books, I've written about him.
All right, well that's good enough for us. So, well, tell us, who is he? Who is this person?
He's a professor at the University of Chicago, and he is, I suppose, the leading behavioural economist in the world. And behavioural economics is this, it's really an attempt to introduce a sort of psychological realism into economics. Classical economics has these quite formal, perhaps unrealistic assumptions about how humans behave. And the behavioural economists say, well, we could add psychology, or maybe just add a bit of common sense, and that would make economics work better.
Can you give us an example? I mean, what is behavioural economics?
Sure. So, I mean, one of Thaler's favourite examples is the bowl of cashews. So he describes having guests over for dinner, and while, the main course is cooking in the oven, they're having drinks, and as you do, he puts a large bowl of cashew nuts in front of his guests. And they're sitting around having their drinks, and they're hoovering up the cashews. They're just getting to them at a real rate of knots. And after a while, Thaler realises they're going to spoil their appetite. So he removes the bowl of cashews, takes it off to the kitchen where they can't touch it. Now, they're grateful that he's done that. They're happy that he's removed the temptation. Now, Thaler's point is, this doesn't make any sense in the framework of classical economics, because in classical economics, if you don't want to eat the cashew nuts, you just don't eat the cashew nuts. And if you do want to eat the cashew nuts, you won't be happy that they've been taken away. So there's no way of saying, well, it makes sense to remove the cashew nuts and put them in the kitchen. But of course, common sense says, well, yeah, of course, I totally understand that. Now, Thaler's insight is not something magical about the cashew nuts. Thaler's insight is these seemingly trivial examples about human nature, they might turn out to be really important. They might help us understand, for example, how financial markets work. Or the example that Thaler is most famous for, they might help us make better pension policy. Because we're always wanting to save for a pension, but then when push comes to shove, we're tempted to do something short-termist and not save. So it's these trivial, common sense, everyday examples made economically significant and economically relevant.
You've described what he was spotting, something that humans do.
Yeah, so Thaler originally started with this list of behavioural anomalies on the blackboard in his office, like stuff stupid people do. So, let me rephrase that. Stupid stuff that people do. And
it kind of goes against what they think they should want, but what they actually end up doing.
It's stuff that doesn't make any sense in the standard economic paradigm. Then he takes it to the economics profession in a column called Anomalies, which is published in the Journal of Economic Perspectives, which is a well-respected journal, where every issue of this journal, he points to something that people do that makes no sense in the framework of regular economics. He debunks all the attempts by economists to rationalise this behaviour, and he shows that it's economically significant. So examples, for instance, there's the December effect. So if I remember rightly, stocks fall in December and then they rise again in January. But this shouldn't happen. In perfect markets, that shouldn't happen. But Thaler identifies it and he said this is important and there's no straightforward way to explain it. So he's pointing to these examples and he's saying to economists, you have to pay attention to this. This stuff really matters.
Okay, well, Richard Thaler's book Nudge was an inspiration to governments around the world. For instance, the UK government set up the Behavioural Insight Unit in 2010. Its remit was to develop ways to get more people across the country to engage with government policies that should help them in the long run, but maybe perhaps they've been putting off. Tim, could you tell us a bit more about that?
So these units were trying to take ideas from behavioural economics and from social psychology, to be fair, and turn them into policy relevant ideas. So how do we persuade people to pay their taxes? How can we reform pension policy? How can we get people to insulate their lofts? Well, the way that happened, it started with a research paper that Thaler published with a guy called Cass Sunstein, who's a legal scholar. And they identified this thing they called libertarian paternalism. Libertarian paternalism is this idea that we keep people's freedom to choose. We respect that, people may know what's best for them. But we also have a paternalistic side. So maybe people don't know what's best for them. Maybe we need to nudge them into doing the right thing. So, I give you the freedom to opt in or opt out of a pension, whatever you want. But maybe I'll nudge you to have a pension by making that the default option.
And then you have to opt out.
And you have to opt out. Now, in classical economics, it doesn't make any difference. You
either want a pension or you don't want a pension.
Exactly. But according to behavioural economics, the default probably does matter. So he introduces this idea with Cass Sunstein of libertarian paternalism. And then they give it this much catchier title, Nudge. And they publish a book called Nudge in, if I remember rightly, about 2007, 2008. It's about 10 years ago. And this book becomes very sexy for politicians. And if you recall, David Cameron was elected Prime Minister in 2010, Barack Obama President in 2008, and both of these men were talking about nudge ideas because it seemed like just a smart way to make better policy. And as they won their elections, then Thaler and Sunstein became highly policy relevant, and these behavioural insight units were set up.
Can you give an example of something a policy that has come to fruition that we think may have had a successful nudge effect?
One of the other things that Thaler says, which is a very straightforward point, is if you want people to do something, you make it easy. You actually have to think about how things are designed. So what happens by default? How many boxes do I have to fill in? Could some forms already be filled in by default because the government, say, wants me to fill in my taxes and they already know a lot of stuff about me. So maybe all that stuff should be filled in automatically and I can just correct it if there's a problem. So, behavioural economics has been used to redesign tax forms, for example, in the United States, basically to try to make it easier to do the right thing.
One of the other things I was reading about Thaler earlier is that some of his work that he's done helps us spot some of the naughty tricks that marketers and advertising use. It's going back to the cashew nuts thing, isn't it? It's like, I don't really want cashew nuts, but if they're there, I'm going to eat them.
Yeah. So, in the book Nudge, Thaler is talking about, nudging people to do the right thing. But of course you can nudge people to do the wrong thing. And advertisers and marketers have known this for a very, very long time. You can nudge people to smoke. You can nudge people to eat fatty, salty, sugary food. These days they have the term evil nudges. And Thaler also talks about something else. He calls it sludge. So sludge is basically just noise when you're trying to make a clear decision, and companies are just confusing you with all kinds of irrelevant information, or just making it hard to unsubscribe from something that you want to unsubscribe to. So yeah, these tricks have been used for a very long time, for good and for evil, in the private sector. Thaler is saying the public sector needs to take them seriously as well. And ideally, one would hope, our enlightened governments are going to use nudges
for good.
In the right way.
I love
exactly
it. It's a force for good or evil. Yeah. Please, governments, use it for good.
But it is a powerful force. It is a powerful force. It's worth paying attention to. And it has been a blind spot in classical economics that we've ignored these design factors and these psychological factors. And I think Thaler he's not the only one, but he's done more than anybody else to convince the economic profession to take these behavioural factors seriously.
Thank you very much, Tim Harford, for being an expert for us.
I try. My pleasure.
Charlotte MacDonald presenting there. Now, Jordan, you look like you enjoy a good selfie.
I'm going to take that as a compliment. And yes, you're right. Because I feel there's quite a well-known saying amongst my friends, and that is selfie or it didn't happen. Say you met someone or something big's happened, you need to get a photograph. You can't just tell people.
Oh, so it doesn't count unless you've got a selfie.
Yeah, exactly.
So like an old-fashioned autograph.
No good. Selfies these days. And I used to work up in Radio 1, which is one of the BBC's music stations, and it's the big pop stations that gets all the big pop stars and film stars coming on. And I got to interview a series of really big celebrities, and they said, you're allowed to take a selfie. We're not against it. But think, does it make you look professional? So I decided I won't, I'll be a professional. And then, as my contract was coming to an end, I realised that I probably wouldn't get a chance again with these people. But I was recording the interviews, we were filming it, but I wasn't on camera. So what I started doing is popping my head across the camera to fix the equipment, so that I would appear on camera just ever so slightly at the start, so that I could have a screenshot to prove that I did actually meet that person. But it ended up looking like I didn't know how to work the camera and that I didn't know how to do my job.
And everyone thought you were rubbish on camera.
And I don't work there anymore. So the lesson is, always get a selfie.
I don't know. I think they're really annoying, and I would be really embarrassed asking someone famous for a selfie. I'm one of those people that ignores famous people if I see them. I don't want them to be big-headed enough because I've realised they're famous, even though everyone else has. I like to ignore famouses.
Oh, interesting tactic.
And I'm a professional, Jordan.
Yeah, you are a professional, aren't you?
Anyway.
Everyone loves a cheeky selfie now and then, don't they?
Yeah. So I'm a professional, and that's because selfies can be quite a serious issue, Jordan.
Sorry.
Did you know that a selfie could affect national security? Let's join the trending team who've been looking into this and checking out the latest trends online.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Griffin. Welcome to BBC Trending, the programme which leaves no stone unturned in its tireless search for the best online stories of the week. Our team of social media maestros is assembled, and first up, Ritu Prasad. Ritu, what have you got?
Yes, Jonathan. So this week I'll be telling you a tale of two films and the debate they've ignited about whether a white gay male filmmaker can do justice to the story of a black transgender woman.
Okay, Ritu, more from you later. Will Yates is also here.
Hi, Jonathan.
Hi, I gather your story is all about a ban on selfies for Russian soldiers.
Well, yeah, everybody loves a selfie, right?
That's right, most of the time.
I'll be telling you why Russian top brass aren't big selfie fans and why they decided to clamp down on armed forces' use of social media.
Intriguing. Okay, let's begin. Will Yates, tell me more about this proposal by the Russian military to ban its soldiers from posting selfies online.
Well, yes, Jonathan, the Russian Defence Ministry apparently has it in for the ubiquitous selfie, and in fact, it's just drafted a law to ban not just selfies, but any social media posts by their professional soldiers.
That seems a bit harsh, so let's start with the obvious question. Why?
Well, in broad terms, they say it's for security reasons, but more precisely, it's because they've had their fingers burnt on a number of occasions where all the big social networks let people show where they are when they post a selfie or a photo. And some of these Russian soldiers simply hadn't bothered to switch their geolocation function off. This was all 3 years ago, and since then, most are a little more careful about how and when they post. But Kirill Mikhailov says there are still pretty simple ways of finding out where photos have been taken.
Even if there are no geotags, we can do the geolocation with other means, which is we just single out specific unique objects in their photographs and videos, and we cross-check them with other photographs from the area where they are presumed to be, which were posted earlier, many times before the conflict. We cross-check that with some openly available satellite imagery like Google, its Russian counterpart Yandex. If we are lucky and if it happens in like an urban area, we can access Street View. So it is pretty easy.
So Kirill and his colleagues have been tracking these social media posts since 2014. So how come the Russian authorities are only doing something now?
Well, the signs are that they've tried. They've clearly been aware of the problem for some time, and that there are now far fewer of these sorts of posts than there were. There's still, though, a steady drip of these images, and they don't make the same kind of headlines that they did 3 years ago. And the Russian authorities seem to have decided that now's the time to take some concrete action.
Okay, but will it work? I mean, can they really enforce this?
Well, that depends who you ask. Many of those who work in this field say it is going to be extremely difficult. Now, Bellingcat is a group who do very similar work to Conflict Intelligence Team. They use open sources to dig beneath the surface of what's actually happening on the ground in conflict zones. And they're probably best known for their investigations into the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17 over Ukraine back in 2014. And Eric Toller is a Bellingcat researcher and journalist, and he isn't convinced the ban will achieve what it's designed to do.
You can't stop the normal human urge of people to share and overshare information, because again, these are 20, 21-year-old kids. A lot of them, just like in the U.S., a lot of times you are from a small town, a village in the middle of nowhere in a rural area, and you join the army. It's one of the best ways for social and economic mobility. And just like in the U.S. and with Russia, when you're coming from maybe being in poverty or from a very boring rural area, and you go and all of a sudden you're doing these exciting things. You're in Syria and you're in Ukraine, you're around these millions and millions of dollars of equipment, and you're seeing all these cool and interesting things. Obviously, you want to share it, to your friends back home in high school or whatever. So, you can pass all the laws you want. People are still going to share to a degree.
That's Eric Toller from Bellingcat, and he's not alone in thinking that this ban won't stop Russian soldiers' social media posts. Kirill Mikhailov from Conflict Intelligence Team also believes that young soldiers will simply find a way of getting past the ban, possibly simply just by disguising their social media with pseudonyms and fake accounts.
I think there will be a growth of that very practice if the ban comes into effect. So our work may become harder, but I don't think that this stops the open source intelligence dead in its tracks.
Kirill Mikhailov from the Conflict Intelligence Team. So although the Russian military is banning selfies, it sounds like the digital researchers who track soldiers aren't worried that they'll be out of a job. Thanks, Will. And now a story about two films focusing on the life of Marsha P. Johnson, a key figure in the LGBTQ movement in the United States. As one of the films, The Death and Life of Marsha P. Johnson, launched on Netflix last week, there's been a debate online as to who has the right to tell her story. Ritu Prasad has been looking into this.
Hi, Jonathan. So this new film was directed by David France, an established American filmmaker. But when it came out, a heated online discussion was sparked by an impassioned Instagram post by Raina Gossett, a transgender activist and filmmaker. She's working on a short narrative film called Happy Birthday, Marsha. And like Marsha P. Johnson, she is a black trans woman. In her post, Raina accused director David France of taking her ideas and using her archival research.
This kind of extraction, excavation of black life, disabled life, poor life, trans life is so old and so deeply connected to the violence Marsha had to deal with throughout her life.
Her post received thousands of likes and was shared widely on Twitter and Facebook. Now, David France has vehemently denied the allegations, saying he supports Reina's film, has donated money to help produce it too. To be clear, this is not a case of plagiarism. David says he obtained all the archival footage he used legally, and the films are very different. But many on social media have argued that a white man should not have even made a film about a black transgender woman, while others are just pleased that the film has been made at all.
This is an outrage. Raina Gossett has done so much to bring the world's attention to the work of trans people of colour, including her own.
Thank you so much for making this doc. I'm watching it now. It is wonderful. All that matters is that the story is heard.
There's lots to unpack there.
Yes, and it's really a twofold story. It's about who has the right to tell the story of an important historical figure, but also when someone in a position of privilege and someone from a marginalized community both pursue the same topic, who morally should tell the tale?
That's a really, really interesting question. So let's start with the subject of these films, Marsha P. Johnson. Who was she?
Marsha Pay It No Mind Johnson was a black transgender woman who, in the 1960s, was an outspoken advocate for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer rights. Most famously, she was involved in the 1969 Stonewall riots in New York City. And many see these riots, which broke out after a police raid at the Stonewall Inn, which was a prominent gay bar, as the start of the gay and trans rights movement in the United States.
Yeah, and that incident and its aftermath have had a lot of coverage over the years, but I've not heard much about Marsha P. Johnson's role in it.
No, and many in the trans community consider Marsha a mother figure of transgender rights, but feel that her story and contribution has been overlooked by this mainstream movement. And in 1992, she went missing, and her body was found in the Hudson River. She was just 46 years old. Police at the time ruled it a suicide, but the community suspected her death was a homicide.
Why do they think that?
Well, they felt that many crimes against their community were not properly investigated by police. And in the year Marsha died, the Anti-Violence Project, an organization that documents violent crimes against LGBTQ people, logged 1,900 cases in New York alone.
And trans people are disproportionately the victims of violent crimes, aren't they?
Yeah, even today. GLAAD, a transgender advocacy group, has reported that 2016 was the deadliest year on record for transgender people in the United States. And of the 21 trans women killed, nearly all were trans women of color.
That's a sobering statistic there, isn't it, Phoebe?
Yeah, it's horrible. And we'll hear more about that story after the break. So do stay with us. We'll be back in a minute.
This is the BBC World Service. Now, close your eyes and listen.
Sound is a powerful medium. It can take you from a busy market to outer space. Create memorable characters.
Your dad believes I was here.
But that doesn't make it a real memory.
To your dad it does.
And intriguing plot lines.
I can't see. Where are you? Here. I want to go. I told you to stay in the car.
If you have a story to tell, why not bring it to life in a radio play? Our international playwriting competition is free to enter and open to anyone living outside the UK. There's a cash prize and a chance to visit London to see your play recorded for broadcast around the world.
The International Playwriting Competition. For details of how to enter and the full terms and conditions, go to bbcworldservice.com/radioplay.
Hello, welcome back to The Thought Show on the BBC World Service with me, Jordan Dunbar.
And me, Phoebe Keane. Coming up, how two films about the life and death of a black transsexual woman have caused a fierce online debate.
And breathing. Why do some people deliberately restrict theirs? And what happens when small children hold their breath unintentionally?
That's all coming up in a moment, but first, the news.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The head of the Catalan government, Carles Puigdemont, has responded to a government ultimatum by threatening to have the regional parliament ratify independence if Madrid refuses to talk. The deadline set by the Spanish government for him to rescind his declaration of independence has just passed. The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been given his own political theory, entrenching his position at the top of the ruling Communist Party. An announcement at the party congress in Beijing said the president's ideas would be known as Xi Jinping thought. The Communist Party says Xi Jinping thought has 14 fundamental principles, without elaborating on what they are. Officials in Afghanistan say at least 43 soldiers have been killed in a Taliban attack on a military base in Kandahar province. A Defence Ministry statement said 9 soldiers had been wounded and 6 were still unaccounted for in the assault in the district of Maiwand. New Zealand's Labour Party will form the country's new government in coalition with the small nationalist party New Zealand First and the Green Party. The Labour leader, Jacinda Ardern, who only took up the role in August, will be Prime Minister. New Zealand First agrees with Labour on limiting immigration and foreign ownership. The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have unwittingly been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Finance Ministry has referred allegations raised by a former cabinet minister to the Serious Fraud Office. Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, butterflies, bees and moths. BBC News.
You're listening to The Thought Show on the BBC World Service. I'm Jordan Dunbar.
And I'm Phoebe Keane. Coming up later in the programme, which part of your body has the same surface area as a tennis court? And what does it have to do with diving?
But first, let's continue the story about the life and death of a black transsexual woman that's caused a fierce online debate. Here's the BBC Trending team.
Many of the issues that are raised by Marsha's story are still really, really important to talk about today.
Yes, and we asked David France, the director behind the Netflix documentary, to tell us about Marsha's contributions to the movement. And he described her as a heroic figure whose name has been dropped from the historical narrative after other leaders at the time deemed her too radical.
She and her good friend Sylvia Rivera, another transgender activist, were considered not only comrades but heroes in the early fights. But early on, by 1973, 1974, the movement was beginning to shift away from the kind of early radical ideas of the early activists toward a more kind of assimilationist strategy. In 1973, they were ejected from the movement, and they were ejected from a recognition within the community of the role that they had played.
Clearly, Marsha P. Johnson is not like the famous gay rights activist Harvey Milk, who's had Oscar-winning films made about him. I've never heard her name before now, which is surprising given her role in the movement. So we've heard there that David France really thinks that this story needs to be told, and he sounds enthusiastic about being the one to tell it. So where's the controversy coming from?
So this is where things get a little tricky. So David France's documentary was just released on Netflix. If you're not familiar, that's a global video streaming service. And the film explores the circumstances of Marsha's death through the lens of a trans activist trying to uncover the truth. Raina Gossett's film hasn't been released yet, but based on the trailer we've seen, it's a fictionalized look at the night before the famous Stonewall Inn riots. In short, these are two very different films.
You mentioned before that there are accusations involving archival footage. I take it that's where things start to get a bit more complicated.
Yeah, so it looks like the two films have different narratives, but they both appear to use archival footage and research around Marsha's life and activism in the 1960s. But under U.S. law, that's not really a concern. Neither Raina or David own the archive footage, so they would both have to pay for its use. And digitizing footage doesn't mean you then own it. It's still just a derivative of the original. So we asked Stephanie Furgang Adwar, a media lawyer from New York, whether sourcing the material ever means owning it under U.S. law.
If you've put the physical labor into the work, there have been arguments made by plaintiffs in cases that say this was created by the sweat of my brow and therefore is mine, and that has failed uniformly. The intellectual property doesn't account for physical labor, the act of changing something or compiling something. What is protected is the expression of ideas. So in copyright, ideas are not protectable.
So it's quite clear-cut then. Based on what we know, there's no legal case here. And as you've said before, it wasn't really plagiarism, but more a question of who the historical narrative belongs to.
That's right. And David says that he'd been envisioning his documentary on Marcia for years before he heard about Raina's film. So it appears that these two works came about independently. But even if Raina has no legal right to the sweat of her brow work, the question that some are asking on social media has been, does David have a right to tell the story at all?
How much more space, time, energy do white, cis, gay men need?
That's Lourdes Hunter, founder of the Trans Women of Color Collective, a grassroots trans rights organization based in Washington, D.C. While she described the film itself as amazing and compelling, she said that instead of making his own film, David France should have used his position as an established filmmaker and a white man to promote the work of someone in the Black trans community, someone like Raina Gossett.
Now, David France is himself an openly gay man. Does the fact he's a member of the LGBTQ movement change anything?
For Lourdes and for many of those who've spoken out from the trans community, it really doesn't.
These stories about Black trans women should be told by Black trans women. There are places in the movement for everyone. People who have access to resources, have access to social capital, access to finances. Their role in the movement is to leverage that access so that the people who are supposed to be telling these stories, who have done the research, who have done the work, who are actually living these lives, voices can be elevated.
That, of course, is not a universal feeling online. And for his part, David France told me that he felt in creating this documentary, he was atoning for his community's past mistakes.
For me to not revisit that story about which I knew so much already would align me with the people who were eliminating their narratives from our history. I think of Marcia and Sylvia as being two of the most historically important figures in the LGBTQ movement. And as such, they belong really to all of us, not just in the queer community, but to all of us as humans, to know that these two individuals, through their political engagements, have impacted human life, not just in New York, but around the world. Their legacies are human legacies, and their narratives have informed our narratives.
What's Raina herself had to say about the discussion her post started?
I've been in touch with her, and while she initially told me she might answer some of my questions by email, by the time of this recording, she actually hasn't done so. She did write an op-ed for Teen Vogue this week and said, quote, "Too often people with resources who already have a platform become the ones to tell the stories of those at the margins, rather..."
Clavicular bones? And now I'm all full, and then I peck with my tongue. Hi, I'm Stig Severinsen, and in 2012 I held my breath for 22 minutes.
Breathing. It's a vital life force. We do it or we die. It's our most natural reflex. We take about 16 breaths a minute. That's around 23,000 a day. So why would anyone consciously restrict it? And what happens to our minds and bodies when we do? This is the BBC World Service. I'm Lucy Ash, and on this edition of The Why Factor, why do people hold their breath? Stig Severinsen is tall and muscular, with a clean-shaven head and piercing blue eyes. A Danish marine biologist in his early 40s, he's been called the human dolphin and the man who doesn't breathe. Here, he's just sawed a hole in a frozen lake in Greenland before plunging into the icy depths, wearing nothing more than his skimpy swimming trunks. He holds the record for the longest free dive under ice, 72 meters or 236 feet. But how does he survive so long without air? Rule number 1, don't think about time, he tells me, or the end result. Otherwise your ego gets in the way.
It's very important to understand that you have to change the frequency in the brain. You also learn to change into what I call your inner dolphin. You tap into this mammalian dive response, and it's a beautiful reflex.
The mammalian diving reflex. That's when blood is diverted from the limbs to the vital organs, the heart, brain and lungs. In the world of mammals, it allows seals and other warm-blooded aquatic animals to conserve oxygen. For the first 6 months of life, humans do this too, which is why small babies find swimming so easy. When their heads are submerged in water, they naturally hold their breath.
You change your brain frequency from beta, from everyday life thinking, boring, analytical, skeptical thinking, into a beautiful alpha state of playfulness. And that's where everything becomes soft and it becomes engaging, it becomes meaningful, and time dissolves.
I'm Toby Hillman. I'm a chest consultant at University College London Hospital. Every time you take a breath in, you're lowering the pressure inside your chest by using your inspiratory muscles, the main one being the diaphragm, and then that draws air in, which is oxygen rich, and then through processes at a cellular level, there's an exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide, and then as you breathe out, that carbon dioxide is taken away, and that's the exhaust gas from what we call aerobic respiration, which is the process by which our cells get their energy.
Somebody told me that if you stretched your lungs out, they could cover a tennis court. Is that right?
Yes.
Or is that just an urban myth?
No, that's very true. The area of the lungs is huge because the way that oxygen gets into the bloodstream is through diffusion, and that has to happen over a very short distance. So the distance between the air that you breathe in and your blood vessels is around 1/250th of the width of a human hair.
Have you got your goggles? Yeah.
Like Stig, as a child I loved picking up bottle tops from the bottom of the local swimming pool, but I could never collect that many before popping back up for air. So can I train myself to hold my breath for longer? I've gone in search of my own inner dolphin in a small pool in London with Liv Phillips from the British Freediving Association. She's the reigning UK freediving champion for the 10th time.
Big breath. When you're at the top of your breath, hold, put your face in the water and relax. Get used to having the water all around your face. Relax your body. Good. Let your head fall.
Liv has a soothing voice. I'm trying to stay calm and zen-like and be at one with the water.
You can come off any time you like.
I fight the urge to emerge, but I just can't take it much longer.
There you go. Feet underneath you. Good. Breathe in. Big breath in before you speak. Good. And again. That's it. Lots of colour. Oh, it's harder with the nose clip, isn't it?
Once I got my breath back to normal, Liv confessed she'd forgotten to time me, so I realised I'd have to try that all over again. Some dive for fun, some out of necessity. Kim Ok-ja is from Jeju Island in South Korea. She's one of the traditional women divers, or haenyeo, meaning sea women. On a single breath, she dives to depths of up to 15 metres in search of seafood.
배워가지고 15살부터는 이제 돈벌이를 했어요.
When I started diving at 15, it was for stuff we could sell in the market. Octopus, sea snails, abalone. We even used spears to catch fish underwater. And by the age of 17, I was good enough to make quite a bit of money. Then, when I was 33, my husband died, and I had the burden of raising our 4 children on my own.
Freediving in Korea goes back to the 6th century, but for the past 300 years, it's mainly been done by women. Intrepid wives and mothers like Kim Ok-ja have long been their family's main breadwinners, harvesting the lucrative seabed while their menfolk farm the land above.
우리 큰딸 낳고 4일 만에
Back then, when I had my first daughter, We were really not well off. So, just 5 days after giving birth, I volunteered to go out to sea. And I left my newborn baby with her grandfather. And I dived to the sea bottom to collect seaweed, the type that's worth quite a bit of money. But that dive took its toll on me. I was sick. My body and face became really bloated.
The first rule of any diving, whether it's free diving or scuba diving or swimming in general, never dive alone. I lost my best friend, and it was a horrible loss, obviously. He just made that one mistake one day. He went free diving alone and he never came back. A blackout is not a horrible experience. You don't know that you're blacking out. That's the danger. It's like pulling the plug from a computer.
In the past decade alone, at least 40 sea women from Jeju Island have died on the job.
지금까지는 병원 신세를 안 보고 있습니다.
I've never had to go to hospital myself, but there was a lady in my village who died a couple of months ago while out diving. Sometimes things can go wrong. Maybe your tools get stuck, or you might get snagged on something. And if you miscalculate and stay under too long, it can be fatal.
So far, we've been talking about people who consciously hold their breath. But some do it involuntarily, says lung specialist Toby Hillman.
When people are asleep, the muscles of the neck and soft palate are actually a bit floppier, so they have less tone. And you can get obstructions to the airways. So that's not necessarily breathing control, but it's more of a mechanical stoppage of air moving. And that's something which is called obstructive sleep apnea. And what we see is that people have their sleep significantly disturbed. It can be really quite dramatic, sort of having 60, 70 breath holds per hour. And sometimes those breath holds can be really very long, so 45, 60 seconds.
If some adults stop breathing in their sleep, some young children stop breathing when they're fully awake. Usually these spells don't last long, but that doesn't make it any easier for parents like Samantha Vanderpaal.
My daughter had been suffering with the virus. It was around about November time, and she was around about 10 months old. I was getting into bed and I heard a noise on the video monitor. It just didn't sound right to me. Something told me to go up to her bedroom, and as I did, she was gurgling and thrashing about, and she just didn't look like my daughter. It looked like a completely different child in that cot. I scooped her up, ran down the stairs to my husband. Then she went limp and stopped breathing. Her eyes rolled back, and she just went from blue to ashen, and I just screamed at my husband, "Call an ambulance. She's died, she's died." Within about a minute, she had come round. I was a mess, my husband was a mess, and she went off to hospital for some tests, all of which came back absolutely fine, and for maybe 2 days, 3 days, she was absolutely fine, and then we encountered it again.
Such fits can happen when a small child has a temperature. That often provokes these breath-holding spells. But Samantha's daughter has a number of triggers.
Usually it's down to emotional stress. So if she has a tantrum, sometimes she just won't take that breath and she'll go blue, and boom, there goes one.
So in total, Samantha, how many of these episodes have you had?
Over 200.
Really?
We were having up to 8 in a day.
And what do you do?
Everything that goes against how it feels to be a mother. I have to leave her on the floor and monitor her breathing, lift her legs up, count, because if it goes beyond 10 seconds, then I have to call an ambulance if she hasn't taken a breath in that time, when all I want to do is cuddle her and soothe her. But realistically, that is actually the worst thing I can do. It will prolong the episode.
You must be in a terrible state of panic.
Yeah. Obviously, I'm trying my hardest to keep calm, because if my daughter wakes from a seizure and sees that I am distressed, it will put her into another one. So it's a case of keeping everybody calm, which is especially difficult if it happens in public.
And has that happened?
Yes. It was shortly after we saw the neurologist and my daughter had a seizure in a supermarket trolley. I was asked if I could video episodes for the neurologist so they can see exactly what's occurring at that time. And the looks I got from other people who must have thought I was crazy. There is my daughter, blue and limp in a trolley, with me making no attempt to soothe her, but standing there videoing her. I remember after the seizure, scooping her up, going outside, sitting in my car and just sobbing, because I felt like the worst mother in the world.
한 푼 두 푼 모인 금전 정든님 술값으로 다 들어간다.
The Haenyeo divers of Jeju Island sing mournfully about how their men are drinking while the women do the heavy lifting underwater. These real-life mermaids have a tough existence, and they seem to be a dying breed. In the 1960s, there were around 26,000 Haenyeo. Now, fewer than 5,000 are left. Last year, UNESCO officially recognized the women as an intangible cultural heritage of humanity. Many, like Kim Ok-ja, are already grandmothers. Younger women on Jeju Island would rather work in offices or hotels than don a wetsuit and hold their breath in the icy Korean straits.
진통제를 언제나 먹고 들어갑니다. 물속에 들어갈 때. 왜냐하면
Divers like me often take painkillers because there are a lot of stresses on the body. And I'm having to increase the doses because I've taken this medicine for so long, it's becoming less and less effective. But, you know, next year I'll be 80. I'm still going strong. And even though I've not completely recovered after my first child, I still feel diving hasn't affected me too badly. And one of my granddaughters now wants to learn to dive like me. She's been to a special dive school on Jeju, where they teach the new generation of women. She's carrying on the family trade.
So are you proud that your granddaughters decided to pick it up?
또 자기가 또 취미도 있고
Well, it was her decision. And while I'm very proud of her for making it, there is a part of me that feels worried about her safety, because I know how tough it is. But she said, I'm strong. I want to do it.
Breath-holding may carry risks, but it's also a powerful force for good, according to former world record holder Stig Severinsen.
When you do breath holding, you're actually stressing yourself and you are actually provoking that stress response, you know, because you're kind of moving closer to death, you know, when you're holding your breath for 2, 3, 4 minutes. But then when you learn to control that stress, it gives you a tool that you know you can use, and you don't have to go to the gym, you don't have to call your mom or your doctor. You know that with your breathing you can resort to that 24/7, and it's reliable.
Stig's record breath hold of 22 minutes has since been broken. It's now over 24 minutes, longer than this radio program. Just imagine that.
Okay, well done. Goggles? Signal? Okay. Okay. Well done. Well, that was the best time you did. Yeah, do you want to know how...
How long was that?
Okay, it was 1 minute 59, so we can call it 2 by the time I stopped it.
Oh no, I could have just held on for 1 more second. I could have done 2 minutes. I was trying to remember. 1:59, just one measly second short of 2 minutes. Not bad for a first-timer, I'm told. Stig's been doing this his whole life. Actually, I found the discipline curiously invigorating. When breath-holding is involuntary, though, it can be frightening. It feels a bit like staring over the abyss towards the end of life.
That was the Y Factor with Lucy Ash. So, Phoebe, tell me, how long can you hold your breath for?
I don't know.
Have you never tried?
Well, I had one of those tests recently, actually, a lung capacity test at the doctor's.
What is your lung capacity?
I'm not sure, but it was a much older age than I am.
Oh.
It said I had the lungs of a much older person, so I was
dear.
a bit worried about that. But then I don't have asthma, so that's good.
That is good.
But yeah, no, when I was doing my breathing test, where you have to puff into this tube thing, she said, oh, you could be a deep sea diver.
Oh, wonderful.
But she probably says that to everyone.
Do you think so?
I think so. It's probably one of those things that nurses say.
Well, I may have the lungs of a startled hamster. However, I used to have a deep sea diving dog.
What?
Yeah, no, absolutely true. And
No
when my
way.
parents first went to meet the dog and take it for a walk along the beach, the owner never said what his job was. And our dog ran into the sea after a stone or something my dad had thrown in. And for about 20 minutes, it never appeared. So my parents started to think, we're going to have to tell this man we've drowned his dog. What are we going to do?
Oh,
and then eventually, Sheba was her name, pops up, runs out of the sea, wagging her tail. And it turned out her owner was a deep sea diver in the Middle East. He worked for an oil company. And so they would go scuba diving and snorkeling together. And she did this all the time.
That's amazing. Incredible. What an amazing dog.
And that's all we have time for this week. You've been listening to The Thought Show with me, Jordan Dunbar.
And with me, Phoebe Keane. We'll be back at the same time next week. Do join us then.
if considered opportune, to vote on a formal declaration of independence.
Sir Tom Jones is the latest entertainment figure to say he was a victim of sexual assault.
What's tried on women is tried on men as well. But then again, not much though. It was only once, really.
How did it make you feel?
Terrible.
And President Trump's war of words with the media.
No, not you. Not you. Your organization's terrible. Don't. I'm not going to give you a question. You are fake news.
And almost half of Americans believe that the news media deal badly with the president. First, the news.
Hello, I'm Jerry Smith with the BBC News. The Spanish government says it'll start the process of stripping Catalonia's autonomous powers on Saturday, after the head of the regional government ignored its ultimatum to rescind his bid for independence. In a statement, the government said Cabinet would finalise measures for the Senate's approval under Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution, allowing for what it called the restoration of legality in Catalonia's self-government. It came after the Catalan leader, Carles Puigdemont, threatened to have the regional parliament ratify independence if Madrid refused to talk. Tim Wilcox is outside the Catalan parliament and has seen his letter.
He said that the Catalan people voted in that referendum, which was considered illegal by Spain on October the 1st, with a majority in favour of independence. 90% of the people who voted, he said, voted to leave Spain on a turnout of 43%. He goes on to say that if you continue to avoid negotiation and dialogue with us, then we will vote on that referendum for independence. So we are in exactly the same situation as we were 8 days ago, following all those moves and counter-moves between Madrid and Barcelona.
The Chinese leader Xi Jinping has been given his own political theory, entrenching his position at the top of China's ruling Communist Party. Michael Bristow reports.
So far, we only have a vague sense of what Xi Jinping thought stands for. The party says it's socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era. That's a difficult phrase to understand, but to a large extent the fundamentals of this new theory are unimportant. This announcement is notable mainly because of its symbolism. Xi Jinping has become the first Chinese leader since Deng Xiaoping to lend his name to a political theory, suggesting his authority extends further than China's previous two presidents. And before, the only Chinese leader to have his own thought was Mao Zedong.
Officials in Afghanistan say at least 43 soldiers have been killed in a Taliban attack on a military base in Kandahar province. Here's Ambarasan Etirajan.
The ferocious Taliban assault began with an explosive packed vehicle ramming the entrance of the Afghan military compound before the militants stormed in. Reports say only a handful of soldiers are known to have survived unscathed after the attack. At least 9 Taliban militants were also reported killed. It's the third major Taliban attack on security installations this week, taking the number of killed to more than 100, including soldiers, police and civilians. There will be questions over high number of Afghan casualties even after the US doubled its air support under a new Afghan strategy announced by President Trump.
You're listening to World News from the BBC. The three sons of the murdered Maltese investigative journalist Daphne Caruana Galizia have called on the Prime Minister Joseph Muscat to resign. Writing on social media, Matthew, Andrew and Paul rejected his plea for them to endorse a $1 million reward to find whoever bombed her car last week, saying the way to get their endorsement was to resign for failing to uphold fundamental freedoms. They said they were not interested in a criminal conviction, only for the people in government who stood to gain from her murder to say that justice had been served. New Zealand's Labour Party, led by Jacinda Ardern, will form the country's new government, in coalition with the small nationalist party New Zealand First and the Greens. Hal Griffith is in Sydney.
Jacinda Ardern only took the reins as Labour leader in August, revitalising its fortunes in a wave of so-called Jacinda mania. Although the party finished behind the ruling National Party in September's vote, it won the battle to negotiate a deal with the minority parties. The agreement, finally announced today, is likely to mean a significant cut to immigration quotas and new controls on foreign ownership of property.
The United States says the militant organisation Hamas must lay down its weapons if it's to play a part in a new Palestinian government. Hamas and its rivals, Fatah, recently agreed to end years of bitter division. But President Trump's envoy has said that any Palestinian Unity administration would need to recognise the State of Israel and disarm what he called terrorists. An explosion at an illegal firecracker factory in eastern India has killed at least 7 workers and injured 9 others. Officials in Orissa state said the explosion completely destroyed the makeshift structure after fire ignited the chemical stocks used to make the fireworks. The accident happened hours before the Hindu festival of Diwali, when the demand for firecrackers hits its peak. BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to World Update from the BBC in London. This is Dan Damon. Later in the programme, going to Zanzibar, people there increasingly returning to traditional healers to cure mental illness.
The girl next to me now is about 15 years old, and she's come forward from the very back of the room towards the sheikh and is reaching out for him and thrashing around on the floor with her fists clenched, attempting to beat the spirit out of her and shouting at it.
More on that coming soon. First, though, the big story, Spain will start suspending Catalonian autonomy on Saturday after the leader of Catalonia threatened to declare independence. Here's what a spokesman for the Spanish government, Inigo Méndez de Vigo, said just a few moments ago on TV.
The Prime Minister has called an extraordinary meeting of the Cabinet on the coming Saturday. In that Cabinet meeting, they will approve the measures that will be delivered to the Senate with the aim of protecting the general interests of the Spanish people, among them the citizens of Catalonia, all the citizens of Catalonia, and to restore the constitutional order in the autonomous community of Catalonia.
Our correspondent Guy Hedgecoe is in Madrid. Guy, this is under Article 155 of the Constitution, I'm guessing. Doesn't the Senate have to vote on that in order for it to go ahead as taking over the autonomous region?
Yes, it does. And I should point out this is an unprecedented move. So to a certain extent, we're in uncharted waters here, and no one knows exactly how this article of the Constitution will be implemented. But the government needs a majority in the Senate. The governing Popular Party does have a majority in the Senate, so that is not a problem in a sense. But what it does want is to get support from other parties so that it can look like it has political support for what is seen as a very drastic move. And it could take at least a few days before it can actually implement this article.
What would it mean in practical terms? What does the Catalonian government run that the Madrid government says it can't run from Saturday?
Well, this is, to a great extent, the big mystery, because it's never been used before in the 40 years of Spanish democracy. The feeling is that the Spanish government could take control, for example, of areas that the Catalan government controls, such as economic areas for the region of Catalonia, for example. And It could also, for example, the Spanish government could also trigger elections in the Catalan region. That's something normally that the Catalan president would do, but under these circumstances, Prime Minister Mariano Rajoy could do that from Madrid, and that's something that he is believed to be thinking about, at least. But he could take control of certain departments such as economy or education or health and so on that the Catalan government currently has control of at the moment.
Because I suppose what we're thinking about is clashes. And when they tried to take over the election rooms, the polling stations, during the referendum, that became violent enough. If you have the prospect of authorities from Spain sending people to occupy parts of Catalonia, that's a recipe for potentially disaster, isn't it?
Well, possibly. I mean, that's certainly what some people are arguing. And I think, putting aside the actual practicalities, the logistics of Article 155, I think symbolically it's hugely important. And there's a feeling in the Catalan independence camp that, a number of red lines have already been crossed by the Spanish government or the Spanish state. This would be yet another one which would escalate things even further. There's been a lot of talk and a lot of debate about the potential use of this article in the Constitution over recent months. And so there's been this massive build-up to this moment. The fact that it's now being triggered is seen as something of a kind of reckoning, a day of reckoning for this crisis. So certainly it doesn't look as if it's going to this is going to calm tensions. On the contrary, it looks like this crisis is probably going to escalate.
Thanks very much indeed, Guy Hedgecoe in Madrid. Let's go straight to Paul Moss, who's in Barcelona. A bit early for any reaction, but what does it look like from there, Paul?
Well, you heard about the massive build-up. There certainly has been a massive build-up, but I've got to say, rather predictably, just at the moment, there's sort of a feeling of anticlimax. I'm sitting in a square watching people going about their daily business as the deadline passed. We didn't have sort of bells tolling or anything like that. People are waiting to see, first of all, when and whether Article 155 is imposed, but also, as Guy Hedgecoe was saying there, it can mean various different things and what will happen, what exactly the measures will mean. People are waiting to see. One thing that's happening here at the moment, I should say, is that it is absolutely bucketing down with rain, and that is relevant. I don't think we're going to see anyone taking to the streets at the moment, really quite sort of monsoon weather. And I've got to say, if I was suspiciously minded, I'd say it looked like an omen. You just can't avoid the symbolism. It's been beautiful days here in Barcelona recently. Now we have stormy times ahead.
Indeed, we can hear the rain behind you, Paul. Is there any negotiation? OK, people are saying things loudly in public. Are they talking behind the scenes?
I haven't had any reports of people talking behind the scenes, but there is a way out. Mariano Rajoy, the Prime Minister, and his government have tentatively offered what you could see as a sort of olive branch. They have said that if the Catalan region was to hold regional elections, then they would back down from imposing Article 155. Now, so far the regional government has said not no, but they've said holding elections is not a priority. That was their phrase. Now, the trouble is, you see that what you've got, I think, is people have backed themselves into corners. On the one hand, you've got Mariano Rajoy, who's under huge pressure within his own coalition to act tough. Remember, he's not got his government is a coalition. He's in power with this party Ciudadanos, which started here in Catalonia specifically as an anti-independence party. Meanwhile, here you've got the secessionists, you've got people like the president, Carlos Puigdemont, who's talked people's expectations up. There's a lot of excitement here. Catalan flags waving. People really think independence is coming. And I think it's very difficult for him now to say, well, actually, we're going to hold off. It might not happen. He's marched his troops up to the top of the hill. I don't know if he can march them down again.
And the impact on the economy. Are you seeing, we've talked about banks, for example. Is there actually any structural, obvious change going on?
There's very immediate change. I mean, first of all, yes, at that sort of official level, we've heard of companies who are removing their domicile to Madrid. But tourism, which is absolutely crucial to Catalonia, particularly here in Barcelona, it's already down. There are reports that bookings went down 15%, that reservations were cancelled. I certainly managed to get a hotel more easily in the centre of Barcelona than I might have otherwise. So people are already being hit. What the question is whether that's going to give pause, whether that's going to create second thoughts. Are people in a mood here to go, well, hold on, this isn't what we were bargaining for? Or are they so defiant that they'll say, look, we may have to take a bit of an economic hit, but we want to press on with independence?
Paul, thank you. I'm sure it's a very cheap hotel and you're doing your own laundry, because that's the way it operates if you work for the BBC. Thanks for that. Paul Moss in Barcelona. We'll come back to that story later. Tropical island of Zanzibar may not be the first place you'd think of blighted by a mental health epidemic, but that's the hidden side of the honeymoon destination. Rates of mental disorders have increased sharply in recent years because of drug abuse, mostly. Nicola Kelly reports that there are some parts of Nicola's report now that you might find disturbing.
On the East African island of Zanzibar, a throng of patients gather in a damp, dilapidated hall to undergo a remarkable form of psychological therapy. The treatment is an age-old spiritual practice trusted by swathes of the population here: exorcism. It begins slowly, gently, with the sheikh, a chiselled, brooding man, invoking the evil spirits in the minds of his congregation. Steady, circular recitations. But within moments, the crowd become frenzied, frantic, surging forward like a wave of tiny, convulsing bodies rising and crashing. Young girls and their mothers are thrown against walls. Others are clawing at the floor, pupils dilated, mouths distended. The girl next to me now is about 15 years old, and she's come forward from the very back of the room towards the sheikh and is reaching out for him and thrashing around on the floor with her fists clenched, attempting to beat the spirit out of her and shouting at it.
I had anxiety and depression, and I'm using tablets in London, but when I come in this place, I feel like I don't need tablets.
So are you more convinced that traditional medicine like this or than healing?
Effective. Very, very effective.
More so than medication in the West?
Yeah.
Ashura is a pious, bespectacled lady. She has travelled more than 7,000 kilometres here to her birthland in search of relief from acute mental suffering. For the thousands of mentally ill patients like Ashura, spiritual healing is their last glimmer of hope. Where it becomes contentious is the profound impact it has on scientific medicine, which is largely distrusted and poorly resourced. Showing me around the island's one mental health facility is this man, Dr. Abdul Wakil Idris, Zanzibar's first and only local psychiatrist. Mental health, he says, is consistently pushed down the government's list of priorities.
Mental health facilities here were the dumping ground for unwanted staff from other hospitals. Anybody who is problematic, send him to the mental hospital. It's pretty disappointing. Mostly people thought of the asylum. Take them, lock them up, possibly drug them so that they sleep. That's it.
And that's what lies at the heart of Zanzibar's mental health crisis: drugs.
The narcotic drugs are within this envelope. So this contains drugs which has been already taken for analysis.
What drugs have you got in that envelope?
This is heroin.
According to the UN's Office for Drugs and Crime, more than 400 kilograms of narcotics have been trafficked over Zanzibar's fluid borders in the past 5 years. And that, says Omar Makame, Chief Inspector of the Anti-Drugs Unit, has led to a steep rise in the number of people affected by mental disorders.
These drugs affect mind. They have been affected mentally. So they act the way those people of unsound mind act. They are acting abnormally. They are just roaming about the street. Sometimes it's go too far.
But while progress on these issues may be slow, there is still one man working against the odds in spite of it all: Dr. Abdul Wakil Idris. Are you hopeful for the future of people with mental health issues in Zanzibar?
Not so much. I'll be lying to myself to say that in the next 20 years things will be rosier. It's a small place. We know each other.
3 flats in central London, and the Pakistani Supreme Court set up a investigative panel to try and investigate where the money came from to buy these flats, because it was alleged by the political opposition that the money came from corruption. Now, as a result of that Supreme Court inquiry, the Prime Minister of Pakistan at the time, Nawaz Sharif, was dismissed from office, and the Supreme Court panel that dismissed him ordered that the anti-corruption court in Pakistan, known as the National Accountability Bureau, file charges against him and against his children. And that's what we've seen happen today. We've seen Nawaz Sharif be indicted alongside Mariam Nawaz, who's his daughter and is widely seen as his political successor, along with her husband. We are expecting later today for two other children of Nawaz Sharif, his two sons who are in London at the moment, also to have charges against them filed by the same court.
What's likely to be the effect of this actually on those who are indicted? Are they in Pakistan?
Nawaz Sharif himself is not in Pakistan at the moment. He's in London alongside his wife, who's recovering from cancer treatment. Two of his sons, who as of yet have not been indicted but are likely to be indicted later today, or if not in the coming weeks, are also in London. Mariam Nawaz and her husband are currently in Pakistan. If they're convicted, they could face up to 14 years in prison, but the family's always denied the allegations, and they've suggested that they're the victims of a political conspiracy. It is quite possible these allegations will continue to hurt their ruling party. Their party, the Pakistan Muslim League, is currently in power at the moment, but there's a general election that's due to take place next year. These allegations and this ongoing corruption inquiry could overshadow or could certainly dominate the lead up to those elections.
Thanks very much indeed. That's Secunda Kamani in Islamabad. Theresa May will have dinner later today with EU leaders. There's a summit in Brussels tonight. She's under pressure from Brexiteers within her party and outside to tell those EU leaders she's prepared to walk away and accept to move to World Trade Organization rules unless EU members agree to open trade talks. Sir Keir Starmer, the opposition Labour Party's Brexit spokesman, says really no deal would be absolutely the wrong thing.
These negotiations are going to go on until October next year. Talking of walking away at this stage is irresponsible. We need to close the gap that there is on phase one, and that's the most pressing issue. What is it that's needed to ensure that we can actually do the deal on EU citizens and undo the uncertainty there? What is it that's needed in Northern Ireland, and can we move forward on the money? Then, of course, we can talk about the next phase.
And Theresa May is getting advice from Yanis Varoufakis. You remember he was the finance minister in Greece during the euro crisis. Here's what he says the British Prime Minister should do.
My advice would be cut your losses. File an application for a Norway-style agreement for a period of 5 years after the expiration of the 2-year Article 50 process in order to enable your House of Commons to debate properly and without a ticking clock and a gun to your head the future relation between the EU and the UK.
Let's talk to Tony Connolly, Europe editor for the Irish national broadcaster RTE, and he's just written a book called Brexit and Ireland, the dangers, the opportunities and the inside story of the Irish response. And Tony, thanks for being with us. I'll ask you to tell one or two of those stories because there's some really interesting elements of how the Irish people reacted when the vote came in that referendum last year. But I just wanted to get your thoughts on where Britain is up to currently. This idea of no deal better than being better than a bad deal, is that still there in the thinking of the British government?
It's still there in certainly the discourse and the debate within the Conservative Party. There are some very prominent voices saying that, look, Britain has to seize the initiative in these negotiations and issue a credible threat to walk away. That's seen in an entirely different light on the European Union side. That's seen, according to one senior official I spoke to, as pointing a gun at your own head and saying, if you don't do what I do, then I'll pull the trigger. There is very little support in the European Union for that kind of brinkmanship, and I think it would ultimately damage the UK a lot more than it would damage the EU. Now, that's not to say that there are not trading interests in the EU that would be affected quite badly by that. I mean, there are countries that are more exposed in a trading sense than others, Ireland obviously being the foremost in that group. But I think in general the feeling in Brussels is that this could be something of a tactic by Theresa May to say, well, look, if you don't give me a speeded up a process towards trade negotiations, then look what will happen. I'm under pressure from the Eurosceptics. You don't really want them to be in charge, but that really isn't flying at the moment. Having said that, they do want to keep the process on the rails. They don't want this to come crashing down around everybody's ears, and they will say that Theresa May's Florence speech was constructive. They will talk about a transition phase for Britain among themselves, but they really want to get more concessions from the UK on the three key issues before they're prepared to move forward.
And one of those is Ireland, and there's a kind of logic, isn't there, because you can't really settle the relationship with Ireland and what the border might mean unless you know what the trading arrangements are going to be.
That's absolutely right, and that point is made time and again. How can you avoid a hard border, or how can you avoid the issue of a hard border unless you address the long-term relationship which will govern customs relationships, customs checks. It will govern things like tariffs. It will govern things like checks on food, on animal products coming across the border and coming back and forward across the Irish Sea. That's all absolutely accepted by the negotiators. However, the Irish government want Britain to spell out more explicitly how exactly it is going to avoid a hard border. And so far the feeling in Brussels and in Dublin is that Britain hasn't really spelled it out enough. There was a paper from the British government on the Irish question, but it kind of sunnily said that we won't have any infrastructure or border controls on the island of Ireland. The problem with that is that it completely disregards the EU's own legal order and the legal order governing the customs union.
How can you square that circle? Well, there's a lot to be said about that. I just wanted to give you a half a minute, really, Tony, just to tell me, what was it like? What was the mood like in the Irish delegation in Brussels when the vote came in on June 24th?
Absolute shock and dismay and disappointment, and this was not an Irish referendum, but of course the implications for Ireland were absolutely enormous, not just because of the peace agreement, the Good Friday Agreement that was effectively underpinned and underwritten by mutual EU membership by both countries, but also the huge volume of trade that goes back and forward between Ireland and the UK. It's bigger than the 5 BRIC countries combined. There are enormous implications in agri-food and in supply chains and so on. So it was real shock.
A lot of pale faces, I would have thought. Thanks very much indeed. And Tony tells that story and many others in his book, Brexit and Ireland, The Dangers, the Opportunities and the Inside Story of the Irish Response, by Tony Connolly. You're listening to World Update from London.
This is the BBC World Service. Now, close your eyes and listen.
Sound is a powerful medium. It can take you from a busy market to outer space. Create memorable characters.
Your dad believes I was here.
But that doesn't make it a real memory.
To your dad it does.
And intriguing plot lines.
I can't see. Where are you? Here. I want to go. I told you to stay in the car.
If you have a story to tell, why not bring it to life in a radio play? Our international playwriting competition is free to enter and open to anyone living outside the UK. There's a cash prize and a chance to visit London to see your play recorded for broadcast around the world.
The International Playwriting Competition. For details of how to enter and the full terms and conditions, go to bbcworldservice.com/radioplay.
This is Dan Damon and World Update. Coming up, more on Catalonia. What will happen next? The Spanish government says it could seize control this coming Saturday. President Trump and his war against the media, apparently almost half of those who were asked in a survey do believe that fake news is one of the problems, and the mainstream media is making it. And we'll go to Afghanistan to find out more about an attack on a military base. First, the news headlines.
BBC News with Jerry Smith. The Spanish government has said it will start the process of stripping Catalonia's autonomous powers on Saturday, after the head of the regional government ignored its ultimatum to rescind his bid for independence. In a statement, the government said Cabinet would finalise measures for the Senate's approval under Article 155 of the Spanish Constitution. The Catalan leader, Carles Puigdemont, has threatened to have the regional parliament ratify independence if Madrid refuses to talk. Chinese state media says the country's leader, Xi Jinping, has been given his own political theory, which would entrench his position at the top of the ruling Communist Party. The state-run news agency Xinhua has quoted other senior leaders as saying the president's ideas would be known as Xi Jinping thought. Officials in Afghanistan said these 43 soldiers have been killed in a Taliban attack on a military base in Kandahar province. A Defence Ministry statement said 9 soldiers had been wounded and 6 were still unaccounted for in the assault in the district of Maiwand. New Zealand's Labour Party will form the country's new government, in coalition with the small nationalist party New Zealand First and the Green Party. The Labour leader, Jacinda Ardern, who only took up the role in August, will be Prime Minister. The British banking groups HSBC and Standard Chartered are likely to be investigated over new claims that they may have unwittingly been used to launder money stolen from the South African state. The British Finance Ministry has referred allegations to the Serious Fraud Office. And scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study, carried out in 63 German nature reserves, showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, butterflies, bees and moths. BBC News.
Hello, this is Dan Damon with World Update. Coming up, getting children to read and making sure they read the right kind of books. That'll be a bit later. First, we go to Catalonia. We find out what will happen. The Spanish government has said it will start the process of stripping Catalonia's autonomous powers on Saturday, after the head of the regional government ignored its ultimatum to rescind the bid for independence. We can speak to Josep Maria Terricabras. He's a member of the European Parliament for the Republican left in Catalonia, one of the 2 governing parties there. Thanks for being with us on World Update. What do you think will happen on Saturday?
Well, probably the Spanish government will follow its way with the idea of controlling the autonomy of Catalonia. But I do also think that the Catalan government will declare the independence, because on the contrary, they will just destroy us completely. The Spanish government has initiated a path which is terrible. Remember October 1, when police attacked and was beating people who peacefully were just voting. That's a terrible situation, yes.
What, in practical terms, though, what can the Spanish government take over? If they send police or administrators, where will they try and go into?
Well, that's difficult, because jurists say that Article 155, which is mentioned, is a very vague one. And in fact, if you read that article, the Spanish government could just tell the Catalan government, please do the right things. Please, what are you doing?
Well, I can read in a translation of the part I think you're referring to. It says the government may give instructions to all of the authorities in the autonomous communities. So there's no roadmap, if you like. There's no timetable.
No, exactly. First this, and secondly, give instructions to the authorities, but not intervene, so that the Spanish government couldn't intervene according to this article. But apparently the Spanish government wishes to intervene, and to intervene in a very hard and a very strong way.
Nonetheless,
I'm
sorry to interrupt you, but nonetheless, for those who are supporters of independence, and you're one of them, it's hard to say this is going well.
Well, I think so, because just we accept what the people decided. And people decided 2 years ago that a majority in parliament, as it is now, is for independence in Catalan parliament. And the 1st of October, in spite of the Spanish police, over 2 million people voted for independence. In a democracy, what can we do but to follow the interest and the wishes of people? That's it.
Are you afraid of what might come next?
Well, not afraid. I would say I'm worried. Yes. Because I don't see what the Spanish government can imagine against us. I don't see that. But it's a dangerous government. It's an extreme right government, in fact. Yeah.
Josep, thank you very much indeed. Josep Maria Terricabras, who's a member of the European Parliament for Republican Left, one of the governing parties in Catalonia, pro-independence. More on that on the BBC World Service, certainly over the coming days. Let's go to the United States. President Trump, you might have noticed, isn't particularly fond of the MMS, the mainstream media.
The failing New York Times, which is like so bad. Or the Washington Post, which I call a lobbying tool for Amazon. Okay, that's a lobbying tool for Amazon. Or CNN, which is so bad and so pathetic, and their ratings are going down.
BuzzFeed, which is a failing pile of garbage.
Fake news by NBC.
Where are you from?
BBC. Okay. Here's another beauty.
There you go, the MSM rather. The mainstream media not on President Trump's Christmas card list, most probably. And apparently nearly half of American voters agree. Politico has done a poll. 46% of those they asked do believe that the news media invent stories about President Trump. We're joined by Leslie Vinchamuri. She's with the Americas Programme at the foreign policy think tank Chatham House here in London. Thanks for coming in. What's your reaction to that survey result?
Well, I think that it goes along with the broader trend that we've seen, that there's declining trust in all institutions by Americans. There was also a Gallup poll that showed that trust across 14 institutions in the United States is down to about 32%. Trust in national news is incredibly low. It's divided along partisan lines. According to the Pew Research Center, trust in national news is down to 34% among Democrats, 11% among Republicans. So trust is at a low. Partisanship over the media is at a low. People are reading very different sources. And of course, there's a view amongst Trump supporters, as demonstrated in this Politico poll that you've referred to, that the media fabricates stories about Trump. So this creates a tremendous problem. If you think about, where is the national discourse, the conversation taking place that used to take place in the media, and now we are faced with the situation where Americans are very divided about the role of the media.
Well, there's such a lot to discuss, but there are 2 points I'd like to discuss with you. One is what's happened to the media scene in the United States, and the other is, of course, what those, and we look at the Russians in this, those who don't really favour the way that we do democracy in the West want is for people, yes, not to believe that there is any such thing as truth, as the right answer. Let's talk about the media scene first. I go to America quite a bit. Over the years that I've been going, I've noticed that even those stations, I better not name them, but the stations that I would have thought would be trying to do what the BBC tries, station, where voters don't really believe anybody, then you can manipulate them. You can lead them in some very dangerous routes.
Well, it's not clear you can manipulate them, right? If what we're seeing is that there's a suspicion of facts because there's a suspicion that there is a disinformation, a very active targeting campaign by the Russians. In this particular case.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I suppose what I was trying to explain is populism can manipulate them. If you have a situation where you don't trust, and you said this, you don't trust institutions, the traditional institutions, then you can start saying, well, it's all those foreigners coming here, or it's those people there who are creating this.
You're absolutely right. What it does is it diminishes the capacity of the media to be an independent forum for having that debate. It gives more power, right? It's one of the mechanisms that this particular president has used to reduce the distance between himself and the public. But again, this is dividing very much along partisan lines, right? We're seeing that the Democrats don't follow this to the same degree. But also there's a big question, right? Whether or not, which layers of media are being infiltrated. Now, of course, the question is about Facebook. It's about social media. But it is a problem, and in a democracy, you need these mediaries to create a very high level of debate, and that is being effectively eroded under this administration.
I'm naturally an optimist. Are you? Eventually, the pendulum will swing, or something else will happen. Things will change for the better.
I think that there is very active mobilization across civil society, across many organizations, across the media. People aren't letting this go. It's a problem that's been identified, it's located, and undoubtedly there will be a search to create a better and a higher level of debate.
Leslie, thanks so much for coming in. Leslie Benjamuri from the Americas Programme at Chatham House, the think tank here in London. You're listening to World Update from the BBC. Let's get some news from Afghanistan. Officials there say at least 43 soldiers have been killed in a Taliban attack. Aulia Atravi is our correspondent there. What are you hearing, Aulia?
That's right. So 43 Afghan National Army soldiers have been killed, 9 are wounded and 6 are missing. And out of the 60 that were in this base that were attacked last night, only 2 survived sort of unharmed. The government is now saying that 10 Taliban fighters have also been killed in this attack.
Tell us about this district, Maiwand. Is that an area that has been in previous times in the hands of the government forces?
Well, it's understandable, this attack, because it's a sort of front-line district for Kandahar, because it lies between Kandahar and Helmand province, and the Taliban have more influence on the other side. So this is understandable why they would attack this particular base, because this was more doable than, say, another base in Kandahar center.
President Trump said that the US would be there as long as necessary to fight the Taliban. Is there any sign of a surge?
Not as such. The huge difference that we see and the difference that the US involvement has made has been the air support. After the NATO forces withdrew in 2014, after that the Taliban started doing really well. They had these special forces that could operate at night, and then they had these huge operations trying to take over provincial capitals such as Kunduz, Helmand province, and then Farah. But then after the Americans arrived, the game changed, and the Taliban were said to be under a lot of pressure, losing territory, suffering casualties, and so they changed this tactic when they didn't have a response to that air support directly. So they went back to their traditional tactic of suicide bombers and car bombs. It's the thing that it's their expertise. It's the thing that they're best at.
Aulia Atravi, thank you. Our correspondent in Kabul. You're listening to World Update. You will have seen, I think, all of the stuff about Me Too, a campaign which has been raising awareness of the prevalence of sexual assault in society, especially in entertainment and media, this following the Harvey Weinstein affair. But it's gone far beyond that, far beyond sexual impropriety in Hollywood. Sir Tom Jones, the singer, has been speaking to our entertainment correspondent Colin Patterson about sexual abuse in the music industry.
Things happen in show business, and sometimes things are covered up and then they come to light, and then there's other people come forward. Sometimes it's like taking a cork off the top of a bottle. Things come out that maybe should have come out years ago. Who knows? But that's the way it is with show business. You are in the public eye, and that's it, good or bad. You have to take the good with the bad, and but justice will out. You know what I mean? If you've done something wrong, you've got to pay for it. Or prove that you haven't done anything wrong. Or what people are claiming that you've done. But when claims are made against people sometimes, even though they get cleared over something, that stain is still there. That's the bad part of it.
Will there be people in the music industry who are worried because of what's been happening in the film industry, thinking that might happen in the music industry now as well, that people will go back and start historical claims?
Well, things have always happened in the music industry as well. You know, there's been people complaining about publicists and, you know, different things that they've been expected to do to get a record contract, just like they do to get a film contract. You know, there's always been that element there that people with power sometimes abuse it. But they don't all abuse it. But then again, if you're true to yourself, you know when somebody's doing something wrong, and you avoid it. And you think, well, if I got to do this in order to do that, then I'm not going to do it. You know, I mean, if somebody physically attacks you, then that's even worse. But just suggesting things and trying to maneuver you into situations, you just get out of there.
You never had anyone try it on you, did they?
Yes.
Really?
At the beginning, yes. There were a few things like that. But, you know, you avoid it.
Good grief.
Yeah. What's tried on women is tried on men as well. But then again, not much though. It was only once, really.
How did it make you feel?
Terrible. But then you think, well, you know, I got to get away from this person, and this is not, it can't be like this. You don't do things just because you think, oh, I should do this. Your own mind will tell you that.
Were you able to tell anyone?
Yeah. But it wasn't bad. You know, it was just somebody tried to pull, you know, it was a question, and I said, no, thank you.
So Tom Jones speaking to Colin Patterson. Interesting that the Me Too campaign generates a lot of very important stories, if you want to have a look at that on Twitter. And also there's a How I Will Change campaign, a hashtag How I Will Change, to get men to recognize that it's not a personal attack, but it is about culture, and the culture is wrong. Have a look at that. You're listening to World Update from the BBC. And the Spanish government says it'll begin steps to impose direct rule on Catalonia after the regional government ignored a deadline to halt its bid for independence. That's our top story. Let me give you one other. Jacinda Ardern is to become New Zealand's youngest prime minister in over a century after her Labour Party struck a deal to lead a coalition government. This is the BBC. The ruling Socialist Party in Venezuela won a commanding victory in regional elections last Sunday. The opposition and the US State Department say it's really not a true result. The win strengthens the grip that President Nicolas Maduro has on Venezuela. The result may have come from high rates of abstention and exhaustion with politics after a grueling year. Protests, street clashes and deaths. The violence on the streets has ended for now, but many problems are as bad as ever, from inflation to food shortages. As Will Grant reports from Caracas, they are influencing every sphere of daily life, even sport.
The recent turbulence in Venezuela has been well documented. Violent street protests and demonstrations, tear gas and riot police. However, for now, a semblance of normal life has returned to Caracas. And in Venezuela, normal life includes baseball. It is the country's national sport. As the Leones of Caracas took on the Bravos of Margarita, the stadium rose as one for the national anthem, a rare moment of unity in an otherwise disjointed and polarized country. But even here, amid their favourite pastime, Venezuelans' problems are never far away. The commentary team at Unión Radio is for most Venezuelans the voice of baseball.
People use baseball to get away from the problems, you know?
One of the reporters, Diego Castillo, put down his microphone for a moment to tell me how the country's political and economic turmoil was affecting the game.
This year, you can see the audience is not the same because the inflation, and today the game is in the afternoon. But in the night, the people are scared to go to the stadiums because coming back to their houses at night, it's very dangerous.
It's not just the fans. The league itself is in trouble. With the Venezuelan economy in freefall, teams receive fewer gate receipts from the turnstiles each week. Even the state-run energy company PDVSA has become a sponsor as the government attempts to keep the league afloat. Luis Avila, the chairman of Leones de Caracas, says they are making cuts everywhere they can.
Hospitality, meals, logistic, transportation, hotels, use of the stadium, that is not our stadium, our expenses are growing in a rate of probably 500 or 700%,
How are you coping?
I'm sorry, but, being very conscious about spending, taking a lot of tough decisions, trying to help the people until the limit we can, but it's not an easy situation.
61.4%. Récord de participación.
Of course, ask most CEOs of a big Venezuelan business how to get out of the crisis, and the chances are they will say the government of Nicolas Maduro must go. However, at least for the time being, there's no chance of that. The regional election victory has strengthened President Maduro's hand, even if the opposition are crying foul. The result raises the spectre of more violence in Venezuela. Earlier this year, many cities were shut down for several months as masked protesters staged pitched battles with riot police. More than 120 people were killed. Through it all, Venezuela's controversial socialist government remains unbowed and unrepentant.
That's Will Grant reporting from Caracas. It's so important to get young people to read, but what they're reading needs to be taken just as seriously. That's according to the Children's Laureate here in the UK. She's Lauren Child, best known for the Charlie and Lola series here. She's giving a speech today saying that writing for children is an art form. They are the toughest of audiences.
Children's literature and children's illustration is not taken particularly seriously, and an illustrated book is often sort of looked down on, but you can get a lot across in a children's illustrated book, and it does lots and lots of different jobs as well, because the words are telling you one thing and the illustration can go in on a different level.
That's Lauren Child. I've been speaking to another children's author, Andrei Kirkov, globally recognised both for children and adults. He's based in Ukraine. You might know his book, The Death and the Penguin. He says writing for children is just so much fun. It makes him very happy. I asked him first about his children's book, Why No One Pats the Hedgehog.
Well, actually, this is a small book for very young kids, for the parents to read to them. It's about a very sad hedgehog who realizes that nobody hugs him, and he is walking in the village and notices how a girl is hugging a kitten, and then a boy is hugging a puppy, and then a man is hugging a horse. So he gets very upset, understands that nobody loves him, and goes away to the forest where he is comforted by a mouse who explains to him that nobody will hug him because he is a wild animal, not domestic one. And so he becomes happy again and becomes friends with the mouse, who is also a wild animal because nobody hugs her too.
It's a lovely story, and it's teaching a lesson, isn't it? And that's what children's books in part are about. Yes, they're entertainment. Yes, they're well drawn so that the children's imagination is fired up, but they do tell you a thing about living.
They must have messages or small details which should remain in the memory and in the understanding of a child, understanding of the world around him or her.
So it's not just getting children to read, it's making sure they read the right stuff. What do you think is the right kind of reading?
The right stuff actually can be also a nice nonsense which makes kids laugh. So I mean, it should be positive anyway. If it is educational, it is plus. But it should be also entertaining because it should teach kids to love reading itself and to look forwards to a new book, new story.
How worrying is it then that children at increasingly young ages are in effect connected to the internet?
Well, it is worrying, but it can be used also by writers, by the publishers, by parents, because in the basis of any internet game or animation film, there is a story with characters to which the kids get attached. So if kids in time told by parents or by somebody that actually there is a continuation of this story in a book, or you can read more about this character in a book. So it can be a good impulse for them to take books also.
We have a particular problem in Britain. I don't know if it's the same where you are, getting boys to read. Girls tend to read much more willingly than boys. How do you deal with that?
Well, we have now finally positive attempts to publish comic books for children, for boys especially, which have something in common with actually video games or computer games. They have also texts, and it shows actually without text, without quotations in the cartoons, in these pictures, it's difficult to understand what is happening. So I think this is the easiest way how to get boys to read books.
As an author in the digital age, do you think books are threatened by the internet or not?
They are threatened, but not to a dramatic extent. I think actually that books are richer than internet, and then actually the internet doesn't really enrich the imagination, and the books can do that. So the main thing is to explain to young readers the books are much more capable in creating a parallel world inside the boys or girls' imagination than internet, which gives already the colors, the pictures, and so doesn't actually provoke additional imagination or additional thoughts.
Andrei Kirkov, writer both for adults and for children. His children's book's called Why No One Pets the Hedgehog. He's obviously got a heart for hedgehogs because he's got a book called A Matter of Life and Death, or Death and Life, which is for adults. And he's comparing what it's like to grow up in the West and under the Soviet Union, which of course he did. And he said the difference between foreigners and those who grew up as children in the Soviet Union is as different as mushrooms and hedgehogs. You can ponder that imagery as you think about your day ahead, and do join us for more World Update tomorrow.